Welcome back to GLB Productions. Bruno Luce here. Thanks for joining me. In this video, I'd like to answer a question from a viewer that involves comparing two mixers that look visually very similar, but functionally have a number of very important differences. Now, this is something that applies to all of us, not just because we often have to make buying decisions between pieces of equipment that look very similar, but at the same time are functionally quite different, but also because it shows the development of the compact mixer market over the last few years. So, the question from viewer Sapita10 is, any thoughts on the Yamaha MG10XUF versus the Mackie ProFX? I'm trying to get my first USB mixer and can't decide yet. Now, he doesn't say which model ProFX, but for this video, I'm going to use the ProFX8 version 2 because it looks so similar to the Yamaha. Now, if you put these mixers next to each other, you can see that they both have 4 XLR inputs and 9 faders in total. They even are about the same size, shape, and they look very, very similar. But as you'll see, they have very significant differences that you need to be aware of when purchasing. Now, this video is not meant to be a comprehensive overview of either mixer, but knowing my penchant for detail, you'll probably get quite a bit of that along the way. Right, so let's have a look at these two mixers. We're going to use a number of important criteria that I think apply not just to this comparison, but to making any comparison between two mixing consoles. So, first of all, price. You need to compare within the same price range for this type of comparison to be meaningful. You can't compare a $200 mixer to a $2,000 mixer even though they may have the same channel count. It just wouldn't be fair. So, the Yamaha at time of filming costs around $269 US, and the Mackie around $229 US. So they are in the same general ballpark, all right? As you'll see, the lower price on the Mackie is partly due to the fact that it's a somewhat older model at this point in time. Next, let's look at the date released. It's important because the age of a particular model has a bearing not just on after-sales support, repair, parts availability, that sort of thing. Older models also tend to be discounted when they're about to be discontinued, and they are generally more widely available used. It's important to understand that analog mixer technology is very mature. So there's no problem buying a model that's been out for a few years. Some classic designs such as the Mackie VLZ series have not really changed much in more than 10 years, and they're still perfectly usable today. So the Yamaha was released in February 2018, so a bit more than 2 years old. The Mackie was released in July 2015. So this is quite a mature model at this point in time, and chances are is that it's on the point of being discontinued. However, at time of filming, it's still listed as available on the Mackie USA website. Next, let's look at the number of input channels. It's very important to look not only at the total number of channels available, but also how they're divided between mono, stereo, and USB. Also take note that when you calculate the total number of inputs a mixer has, as indicated by the model number, stereo channels count as 2 as do USB channels. So the MG10XUF has a total of 10 input channels. It has 4 mono mic line channels, 2 stereo line level channels, and 1 channel that can be either stereo line level or USB. It has a total of 7 input faders. Compared to the Mackie, the Yamaha has 1 additional stereo input channel, which can be analog or digital via the USB input. Now, when it comes to the Mackie, things are significantly more complex. If you look at the model number, it says ProFX8. Now, this would imply that it has 8 input channels total. And if you just take a cursory look at the mixer, this appears to be true, right? So at first glance, it does in fact 8. It has 2 mono mic line channels, 2 hybrid channels, which can be mono or stereo. We'll get into that later. And 1 stereo line level channel. It has a total of 6 input faders. Now, let's look at this in more detail. It actually has 3 additional stereo inputs that need to be mentioned. First of all, the USB input, which is a stereo input, right? Because it is left and right. Second, it has a stereo return, abbreviated STRTN channel, which is basically a stereo input channel with no EQ or other routing options, right? It can only be routed to the main mix on this model. Traditionally, this type of channel was used to bring the output of an external effects processor, like a reverb, back into the mix. Thirdly, it has a tape input, which can be used as an additional unbalanced stereo input. So if you add all of these up, you actually have a total of 14 inputs, right? The 8 obvious ones and 3 more stereo inputs for a total of 14. So at this point, you can see that technically the Mackie has more, although the way that they can be deployed is somewhat more limited than the Yamaha. All right. Next, let's look at the input channels themselves. It's vital to look at how they are configured, right? Small details can make a big difference to how the mixer integrates into your particular setup. In particular, you want to look at the input connectors, switches, and EQ configuration. So, first, the Yamaha. If you look at the Yamaha, you'll see that the first 4 input channels are nearly identical. All have a Nutric combo connector, pad and high-pass filter switches, and 3-band EQ. The difference is that the first 2 channels have Yamaha's 1-knob compressor. The Mackie has no onboard compression, so if that's something that you need, then you need to take that into account. The Mackie also has no pad switches that are visible, but in reality, the pad is built into the 1/4-inch line level input, which passes through an internal pad before joining the same circuit as the XLR. All right, so Yamaha, fairly straightforward. Now, if we look at the Mackie, first of all, the differences between the first 4 channels, right, the really obvious ones, are more significant. If you look carefully, you'll see that the first channel has a high impedance switch. That switch that is labeled high Z, that is basically a built-in direct box, right? And it allows you to connect passive guitars and basses directly to the mixer. This is not present on the Yamaha. The other thing that you can see that is quite obvious is that the Mackie does not have the combo connector, right? It has a XLR input, and then it has a separate 1/4-inch input, which is used for the line level input. This can be an advantage in some situations. For example, it allows you to leave the XLR connector plugged in and then temporarily plug in a 1/4" connector for temporary use, right? That will override the XLR, and then you can unplug it when you want to use the XLR again, all right? This is useful in some permanently installed situations, etc. Another important difference, the Mackie on its first 2 channels has insert points, all right? Now the insert is basically a input and output combined into one connector that allows you to use an insert cable to connect to the inputs and outputs of an external processor. For example, a compressor, a noise gate, or that sort of thing. The Yamaha does not have these, and in fact there are very few modern analog mixing consoles that retain these insert points, all right? They are very much a old school throwback feature, and it's nice that the Mackie has held on to these on its first 2 channels. Now, channels 3 and 4, or rather 3, 4, 5, 6 on the Mackie, are hybrid mono stereo channels. The XLR is mono. The 1/4" inputs can be mono or stereo depending on how many are connected. This allows the mixer to be configured differently depending on requirements. It can be 4 mono, 1 stereo, or 2 mono, 3 stereo, or anything in between. The Yamaha doesn't have this flexibility. It's always a 4 mono, 3 stereo channel mixer. All right? So again, you can see the mixers look very similar, but there are important differences that we need to take note of. Now let's move on to the EQ section. In this area, these 2 mixers are basically the same. Both of them have fixed 3-band EQ with shelving low and high controls and a peaking mid which is set at 2.5 kilohertz. The Yamaha uses the traditional frequency centers of 100 Hz and 10 kilohertz for low and high respectively. The Mackie, on the other hand, brings the low control down to 80 Hz, which is useful for kick drum, and puts the high at 12 kilohertz. Frankly, 10 to 12 kilohertz, no real difference there. Okay, now the number of aux sends. This is critical to consider, especially if you're going to be using the mixer for group recordings or live sound. The Yamaha has only 1, all right? This also doubles as the send to the internal effects unit. In fact, it's labeled FX, right? In reality, it is a post-fade aux send that is routed to the internal effects unit. It can double as a monitor send, but then you lose the ability to use the internal effects. In other words, this mixer is not really suitable for situations where you have stage monitors that need to be controlled separately from the main mix, all right? And in many small venues, that is perfectly acceptable because there's no room for stage monitors, or the mains are so close to the performers that effectively they are mains and monitors all in one system. The Mackie, on the other hand, has 2. It has one which is labeled Mon, which is pre-fader and pre-mute. In other words, when you press the mute button, the monitor aux send still passes signal. Now, this is ideal for stage monitors or for allowing artists to hear themselves during a recording session. The first aux send also has its output on a fader, right? The fader that is labeled Mon is actually the master control for the first aux send. This is very useful when using it for live sound, as you can easily control the overall level of your stage monitors, right? Stage monitors feeding back, quickly pull that fader down and you'll typically kill the feedback straight away. The second aux send, which is labeled FX, this feeds the internal effects unit. Now, it can also double as an additional aux send, but once again, you lose the internal effects and it is also post fader. So when you adjust the faders for the main mix, you will find that the monitor level goes up and down. Not ideal, but usable in a pinch. Moving on down the face of the mixer, we discover that the Yamaha has on switches, whereas the Mackie uses mute switches. Now, mixers will have one or the other. With the mute button, you could say that the channels are on by default. Pressing mute turns them off. With the on button, the channels are off by default, and pressing the on button unmutes them, right? It's two different schools of thought. Neither one is superior, they're just different, okay? Personally, of late have been preferring the on system because it means that channels are off by default. In other words, if there's something wrong with that channel or there's some signal coming in that you didn't know about, it won't cause you problems. Note that some very small mixers, in particular those with rotary volume controls, right, have no mute or on functionality, which can be an issue because you have to turn the control all the way down to mute the channel, which loses the place where you were. So in this case, the Yamaha has on buttons, Mackie mute buttons. Next thing we want to consider is the presence of PFL buttons. This is vitally important to consider, and many people overlook it because they allow you to set gain very precisely, and more importantly, they allow you to monitor individual channels in your headphones before bringing them into the mix. This is also very important when it comes to any kind of troubleshooting. So, the Yamaha has PFL buttons. The Mackie has no PFL buttons. I find that this is a critical omission, in my opinion. Now, with the Mackie, there is this level set light next to the gain control, and the idea there is that it flashes when the signal reaches 0 dB on the meters. But then how are you supposed to monitor individual channels, right? If there's a problem. Not having the PFL buttons, it can be okay for recording, right? Where you're only tracking 1 or 2 channels at a time, but for live sound, I consider them to be quite essential, all right? Now, people might disagree with me, and that's fine. It just depends on whether or not you need the functionality for your own particular situation. All right, now, onboard graphic EQ. This can be useful for broad tone shaping, but it's important to bear in mind that simple 6 or 7 band graphic EQs are too imprecise to be used to notch out specific feedback frequencies as one would do with, say, a 30 or 31 band graphic EQ. All right, so the Yamaha has no built-in graphic EQ. The Mackie does have an onboard 7 band graphic EQ, which can be patched to the mains or to aux 1. All right, again, this can be useful in certain situations. If you don't need it, just bypass it. Next, both mixers have onboard effects. However, there are significant differences between them, all right? It's very important to look not just at what effects are available, but also how they can be routed. So, with the Yamaha, there are 24 effects available with a parameter control that allows you to fine-tune things like reverb and delay time. There is an FX return fader with on and PFL functions. This allows you to listen to the 100% wet effect, and it also makes it very easy to blend the affected and the dry signals. Right? This is important for live sound use. On the Mackie, there are only 16 effects, and as you can see, there is no parameter control. The Mackie also has an FX return fader, but crucially important, it has an FX to monitor knob. This allows you to send the effects to any stage monitors which might be patched in to the aux 1. All right? This is not possible on the Yamaha. Now let's look at the USB input. This is something where you need to check details carefully, in particular the routing options. Now, both mixers have a class compliant USB input. What that means is that it will generally communicate with computers without the need for additional drivers, right? Just plug and play. Both are stereo bi-directional, which means 2 channels in and 2 channels out. It's not a multi-track interface. Now, let's look at the Yamaha. The Yamaha, being a more modern console, has superior routing available for the USB input signal. Basically, one entire input strip, the one that's labeled 910, can be dedicated to the USB input, and this means that you have full access to EQ, FX, a fader, and a mute control. There is also a 2-mon/2 stereo switch, which allows you to route the USB input to just the monitor outputs for recording use or to the main stereo outputs for live use. All right, now this is something which you really should consult the manual on. It is explained very well, and it shows you how this can be used in conjunction with the stereo mute switch on the monitor phones knob in order to really fine-tune the functionality of the signal coming in from the PC for your specific situation. The Mackie, on the other hand, has only one routing option for the USB. There's just a single knob that allows you to route it to the main mix. That's it, right? It can't be sent to the internal effects unit, monitors, or other destinations. Below the knob, you can see there is a USB through switch, and that controls whether the audio input from the computer goes back to the computer on the USB input, right? This is an important functionality for overdubbing versus live recording. Again, the manual has a very good section on this, which I would urge you to read if you are buying this mixer primarily as a USB interface. Related to this is the studio monitor or monitor output that is present on the Yamaha. All right. What this is this is basically a stereo version of the headphones output. And it's an important consideration if you're buying the mixer primarily for recording. On the Yamaha, this allows you to connect the main outputs to your recorder while connecting the monitor outputs to your studio monitors, right? As I always tell my students, that monitor out is studio monitors, not stage monitors. Stage monitors, you would use an aux send. Now, if you're recording via USB, it allows you to monitor the input signal without sending it back to the computer, all right? And again, those of you who have some experience with this know that there is always the possibility of a feedback loop being formed when you're using the computer as both a playback as well as a recording device. So this is the functionality that allows you to manage that. As I mentioned before, it also includes a mute switch on the monitor or phone's level control, which allows you to mute the direct sound from the mixer and just monitor the output of the DAW, right? Your recording software in your computer, whether that is Cubase or Pro Tools or even something like Audacity. This is a really well thought through design that addresses the needs of both live sound as well as recording. All right, now on the Mackie, all of this is not available, right? Although the USB through switch does address some of the issues. Next, power supply. If we look at the back of the mixer, right, you'll see that the Yamaha has an external power supply, also known as a line lump, right? Now, believe it or not, this is actually better for recording, right? Because the power supply can be a significant source of noise because it's got a transformer in it, and as a result, it is a possible source of electromagnetic interference. Keeping it away from the mixer is actually a very good idea, right? And in fact, one company, Rain, did attempt to create a standardized external power supply for all of its outboard gear, right? Ultimately, this was not successful, but it was a very good idea, right? And you can look that up on the internet if you're interested. The company is Rain, R-A-N-E. The only thing is that external power supplies are a huge pain in the ass when it comes to using the mixer for mobile use, right? They're heavy, they're cumbersome, they can be lost, they can be forgotten, and this is exacerbated by the fact that they are relatively small and they are black in color, right? So for mobile use, live sound, not a good idea. The Mackie, on the other hand, has an internal power supply, much better for live use, can't be lost, can't be left behind, no special power cabling or adapters are needed. Just connect a standard IEC connector and away you go. Again, important differences, need to take note of them for your specific situation. Finally, let's discuss overall aesthetics and ergonomics, all right? This is an important consideration for an analog mixer where there is no possibility of remote control via an app, all right? What you see is what you got to mix with. So things like the shape of knobs, the spacing of knobs, very, very important considerations for an analog mixer, especially one which is designed to be compact. Now, a lot of this is subjective, but having used the class of mixers that both of these come from, I think I would say that the Yamaha has a slightly less cluttered layout. There's more space between the knobs. The panel text is light gray rather than white, which gives the mixer a somewhat more subdued look, all right? The knobs have a pronounced crenellation. What that means is that there are big ridges around the outside of the knob, and this makes them relatively easy to grip. Between the two, I definitely prefer the Yamaha knobs. Another thing about them is that they flare out at the bottom and they have a secondary pointer indication where they meet the panel, right? Which can reduce parallax error. What this does is it helps to space out the top of the knobs so that it's easy to get your fingers in between. The Mackie, on the other hand, has, in my opinion, a more cluttered layout. Some of the text, for example, the text next to the brake switch, it's really, really tiny, which means that this is not the mixer for you if you have old eyes or you have trouble seeing things up close. The knobs are smooth-sided and more of a taper. The pointer design with a solid inner dot that then flows into the pointer running down the outside is easier to read, in my opinion, right? But it means that there's less space between the tops of the knobs. So this is one of the reasons why it's a good idea to, if you can, try and feel the mixer, right? Try and, look at it in a showroom, get your fingers on the knobs and actually see, can I operate this mixer under low light conditions, high stress conditions, that sort of thing. So, in conclusion, what do we think between these two mixers? Well, the Yamaha is more expensive and it's a more modern console. It has good functionality for both recording as well as very small live shows where no stage monitoring capability is required. It has a very well-rounded feature set, right? In particular, having faders, channel on-off buttons, and PFL buttons is a real plus at this price point. I would say that the key disadvantage of the Yamaha for mobile use is the external power supply. If you're just using it for recording and it doesn't get moved much, this is actually an advantage. The Mackie is an older and a less expensive console. It has more traditional connectivity, such as analog insert points, stereo returns, tape input and output, as well as the onboard graphic EQ. It has limited USB routing options, right? It's basically designed to act as a playback interface for playback during live shows or overdubbing during recording. I would say that the Mackie is more suited to live sound with 2 aux sends and the ability to route the output of the effects processor to the monitors as well as to the main mix. The Achilles heel of the Mackie is the lack of PFL functionality. All right, so I hope that this mixer has been useful, and I hope that I've impressed on you the fact that whenever you make buying decisions, it's important to look into the details of the products that you are buying. Any good retail outlet will have a product specialist who can walk you through these details, either in person or over the phone, right? They will be intimately familiar with the products that they're selling, and they'll be able to point out these small little details which are so important, right? Things like the fact that the Mackie can send effects to monitors, right? The Mackie has no PFL buttons. All of these things will enable you to build up a very solid picture of whether or not the product works for your needs. And that's really what it's all about, right? Does it work for you in your specific situation? So, thanks very much for watching. This has been Bruno Luce with GLB Productions. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.